I want to thank Mike for organising the conference and for inviting me, and also for you coming along and listening to the talk. So the talk's in three parts. First two parts are crazy, but they are real and they happened. The first part concerns my being victimised for over 2 years by a female BPD. BPD stands for borderline personality disorder, which some of you may have heard of. I'll maybe mention a bit later, or if anybody has any questions about it, I can maybe have some comments on that. Female BPD sexual harasser and stalker Charlotte Corsier eventually committed suicide in Oxford in June 2013 when her boyfriend dumped her a couple of hours after that. Second part, we'd known each other for several years, so we'd known each other for about 5 years. Second part concerns the witch hunt of harassment, defamation, intimidation, and abuse from feminist vigilantes. In Oxford, this witch hunt was set up by Corsier's American feminist housemate, Brooke Bernson, and Bernson's feminist supervisor, who was an academic at Oxford called Dr. Paula Boddington. There's a brief summary of this story as well in Janice Fiamengo's book, Sons of Feminism, and those pages, just 3 pages. And what I'm saying will overlap with some of the things that Janice was talking about. Janice was really talking about the saturation level, control that feminist ideology has in higher education and the university sector. She was also emphasizing that this is not a couple of peculiar people in an Arkansas community college, but it's at the most elite institutions in the world. She was discussing Canadian universities, but it's just as true at Oxford and Cambridge and the LSE and so on and so forth. And in the US, places like Harvard and Princeton and stuff. And the third part, I'll just mention some of the issues that he raises, the two main issues that he raises, but he raises many related issues, one of them being feminist witch hunting, and the other being feminist excuses for sexual and domestic violence against men. Okay, so that's the first part. Okay, so the second part, I'm just going to provide a timeline of the events in this long, complicated story. It's a story that people often don't get because it's really, really complicated. So even people who've been involved in it as witnesses will still ask questions about it years later, and they'll just say, oh, it just clicked that this is why this was happening. So for example, although I had to represent myself when I appealed, I had no legal representation. I'm quite an effective advocate myself, given an opportunity, so I didn't really need so much legal representation. But the union did actually help a bit, and at one point the union person who sat in on some of the meetings said to me just before, it just clicked with me, now I understand why she was contacting you. She wanted you to rescue her again, like you did years before. And I said, yeah, didn't I tell you that before? So there are lots of things like that. Anyway, this is the timeline. So we met for the first time in November 2008 when I was a lecturer and she was a student. And we became extremely close over the next 2 years. In the first couple of months, Corsia dropped out. She actually changed her name. Her name was Markloon. Back then, you'll see an indication of this, I think, in one of the messages. She dropped out of her course and made several suicide attempts. One of them I prevented. Actually, maybe 2, or maybe 3, in fact. It's hard to count. So she, in February of 2009, she took an overdose of paracetamol and sleeping tablets and had to go to hospital. I had to go and find her and take her to hospital. Pretty sure that if that hadn't happened, she would have died that night, or the next day, or would have died of kidney poisoning, which is what happens if you overdose with paracetamol. Anyway, this settled down, actually, after a couple of months. This was, by the way, not secret. It was notified. Relevant authorities were told about it. Counselling service and stuff like that were told about this. It's not secret. I told the counselling service and my head of department and stuff. But it settled down, and after that, we were friends, close friends, for the next couple of years. At the time, I thought this was just a short-lived crisis. I thought there was just some bad thing that happened. I couldn't figure out what it was, what this bad thing really was. She had described a previous suicide attempt from a year earlier. She described various relationships and stuff that had all gone wrong. I'd never heard of BPD at the time, so that will come back later. September 2009, she returns to university. We remain really close. I'm going to go through this now a bit quicker. She contacts me lots of occasions. We're really close. We meet. We sometimes go for coffees and stuff. In May of 2010, at this point, she's told me that she's in love with me. She has an argument with my wife. We eventually split up, my wife and myself. And when she did this, she was actually reported to the police and detained. And people have said to me after, why don't you just never speak to her again? But I did break off contact with her for about 6 months. About 6 months later, my wife and I split up, and I went to live with a friend called Matthew. And we start getting divorced at that point. After that, Corsia contacted me by text message, and we talked for the first time in 6 months. She invites herself over to where I'm staying. And then we have a short relationship. It lasts about 3 months, and it's hell. Didn't break any university rules. She was not my student. I wasn't her supervisor or tutor or anything, but we were both in the same department. So I experienced domestic violence from her, control, manipulation. There were 2 sexual assaults by her on the 20th and the 24th of November. Second is I witnessed by my flatmate, and then I break off contact with her after that. On the second occasion, the Edinburgh Police, Midlothian Police, Borders Midlothian Police, are called because of her assault and refusal to leave. And my flatmate actually recorded this attack in his diary, and the police officer who I spoke to gave me this little incident note, which I did keep. There it is. That's a note that they give you. Then she begins stalking me, and my flatmate noticed this, that she'd been hanging around outside my flat. She sent me huge numbers of text messages. She's harassing me and threatening me. I'm ill for a short period. I have a really bad infection. I text her friend. Charlotte's still threatening, stalking me, threatening to kill herself. So that's January 2nd, 2011. During 2011, I went to work abroad. I went to work in Germany for about a year and a half, and speaking to medical friends after that, after these incidents, they say essentially the same thing, that this is, all of this stuff, this manipulation, this domestic violence, this lying about stuff, these suicide threats, all of the relationship troubles that she has in the past, this is just borderline. It's just classic borderline personality disorder. It's not depression, sometimes comorbid with depression. It's not anxiety, it may be comorbid with it. It's not PTSD, it may be comorbid with it, but it is borderline. And borderline is extremely dangerous. Borderline is like a time bomb. I'm stalked later at an Edinburgh bar. It's a long, complicated story about that. She sends me text messages and emails that I ignore. So for a whole year, I ignore all of these messages. She sends me love letters, all kinds of stuff. I respond a couple of times, but I don't really want to speak to her. But at the end of the year, I sent her a short message, and she rang me, and we spoke on Skype several times. That was crazy. But I made a mistake. I told her that I'd applied to Oxford. And that's how she knew I was going to Oxford, and some people told me that was stupid. I shouldn't have told her, but I did. About 6 months later, November to March, she reveals on Skype that she is following us to Oxford, and I become very ill. It's another message from me, don't contact me ever again. My wife and I then reconcile about a year and a half later. This is in the middle of 2012. because I've been working in Germany and I've got this new job, so this is like a new chance for us. So we reconcile, and she'd been living in Edinburgh, I've been living in Germany. And so we moved to Oxford around about August, I think, 2012. And Corsair arrives later and begins stalking my wife and son. So once every week or two, my wife notices that Corsair is loitering in the vicinity. And I knew, of course, that she was obsessed with my wife and my son, but a lot of people think this is crazy, but this happened. One day at the end of November 2012, I avoided her completely as much as I could in Oxford. One day she follows me outside the Faculty of Philosophy at Oxford, initiates a conversation for a few minutes. This is eyewitnessed, by the way, so this is not just my testimony. This is actually eyewitnessed, this event that happened by a postdoc. It's 5 minutes of insanity. It's the last conversation we ever had. During this conversation, I should laugh about it because it's all tragic and crazy. She tells me that her father wants to kill his children and be crucified. And she has, I think she has a fairly crazy background, family background. From October 2012 through to March 2013, she's treated at the psychiatric hospital in Oxford, the Warnford Psychiatric Hospital, explaining that she is suicidal. She has a boyfriend during this whole period. His name's Ben Fardell, and she has an abortion. And she felt that she had murdered her child. She was actually strongly opposed to abortion, so that was very traumatic for her. At this point, various notifications are made actually to the university by me and by a friend of mine, but these are all ignored. These are welfare notifications. And then suddenly she begins stalking me at my seminars, so she turns up. There are two things on 2 consecutive days. One is a seminar at the Faculty of Philosophy, which is faculty, and the other is at my college, which has nothing. In Oxford, the colleges are separate from the university, separate from the faculties. The colleges are all completely separate. So she turns up at my college to an event that a club that I've set up. She knows about it because it's advertised on Facebook. So she's found out about it, and she turns up and sits 1 seat away from me, pretending not to know me. This is somebody I've known for 5 years, and all this stuff has happened. She comes and sits 1 seat away from me, pretending not to know me. So I'm terrified by this, and I email her and tell her to leave me alone. And then she retaliates, and she sends a letter, but the letter turned out to be written by feminist activists that she'd been connected to, and she then, cajoled by these activists, she lies to the police, the Thames Valley Police, that stands for TVP, and they give me a PIN, which is sometimes colloquially called a harassment warning. The technical name is a personal information notice. And then I tell them, this person is extremely unstable, she was stalking me, I told her to leave me alone, and she has a really crazy history of abuse in the background, in the past. And she's attempted suicide as well. So this is directly given to both police officers. I can prove it. And in fact, I'll come back to this a bit later. I tell a couple of academics and the chaplain of my college about my concerns, about her stalking. On the 3rd of June, she stalked me again at a seminar at the philosophy faculty. I turn up there, and she suddenly is in my vicinity there staring at me. And I try and report this to the police, who've told me that I should report anything to the police if she contacts me again. So I was becoming extremely worried about this, and then 7 days later, her boyfriend, we hadn't spoken to each other in Oxford apart from this crazy conversation. I avoided her. She had a boyfriend. I didn't know who the boyfriend was. I knew nothing about her, where she lived or anything. Her boyfriend dumped her in Oxford. She threatened him with suicide. She returned to Oxford, and then she committed suicide a few hours later in her home. She hung herself with a scarf. And I was told about this the next day. So that's the end of the first part. Here are some examples, but I'll just skip through these. These are some emails, and this is the text message to her friend Rosa. This is me replying to one of her messages in the middle of 2011. I've no idea what you're referring to. She'd sent me some message, I can't remember what it was. Please stop sending abusive and threatening emails. So this is me telling her to leave me alone. This is in 2012. I was actually going to a conference in Vienna. Academics do that kind of thing. I'm going to train near Vienna, just don't contact me again. And then this is on the Pembroke College when she came to the college, and I just said, just don't contact me again. After her suicide, how much time do we have? So after her suicide, her housemate, still don't know any of these people. I've never met any of these people. Her American feminist housemate, Brooke Burnson, and her housemate's feminist supervisor set up a vigilante campaign against me. And they recruited lots of other militant feminist zealots, including Suzanne Horsenbach, Jennifer Saul, and others. It's very complicated, and at some point there are probably hundreds of people chasing me. It's not just one person goes to the police, there's a police officer in charge, maybe a lawyer. This is like I'm now being portrayed as an evil murderer, and I'm being called a predator and a murderer. And that's what Brooke Burnson is telling everybody. And she should have been stopped. She should have been stopped immediately. So they smeared me with these fabrications. They cyber-harassed me. I was called a murderer. Cyber-harassed me and my family with anonymous messages, calling me a murderer. I reported this to the police. I was intimidated and libeled on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, feminist blogs. This is long before it goes into the press. This is like 6, 7, 8 months before it goes into the press. Okay, the press is afterwards. This is the campaign of vigilantism. They demanded the mob would meet various people and demand that I stop teaching and that I not be allowed to do any teaching, and they succeeded. They eventually drove us out of our home because I reported the cyber harassment a couple of times, and the police said, this sounds bad, maybe you need to get out of town. So if you read the history of, for those of you who are not British, there's a great rivalry between Oxford and Cambridge Cambridge University was founded by a group of scholars who were driven out of Oxford in 1209, and they were driven out of Oxford actually because of a death of a young woman in Oxford in 1209. And they went off, some of them went off to this cold, horrible place in East Anglia, technical college out there where they do maths and physics and crazy stuff, and I know it fairly well because I went there. And they created Cambridge. But the next time they chased an academic out of Oxford was in 2014. And then as a result of this pressure, it's complicated, and I can explain it later if anybody wants to ask a question about it. By that mob pressure, and Paula Boddington was involved in this campaign, they got a couple of statements, one by Brooke Burnson and one by the boyfriend, read out in a coroner's court. I wasn't consulted about it, I wasn't asked for a statement, I wasn't told about it. I was told I was not going to be mentioned. Later, the senior coroner apologized for what had happened. And as soon as that was read out in the coroner's court, it was then published in the national press. And then, so the national press published these stories on the 26th of February 2014. You can read these stories. These stories are insane. They essentially call me an abuser. They call me a stalker. They call me a harasser. They're insinuating that I'm a murderer. And it's crazy. And a few days later, the university fired me, and that was after the vigilantes had published their open letter. As we heard, I think that Janice may have mentioned in her talk these open letters. That's one of the standard techniques of social justice outrage, mob culture. A group of major intellectuals are going to get together and write their open letter. So Jordan Peterson has been subjected to this, and Laura Kitness, who I know as well, has written about Title IX stuff in the US. And this really is a kind of Title IX thing that happened behind the scenes, but happened to me. But this is all the stuff that's closer to the surface and more visible. So I was fired. So I was publicly smeared and vilified with complete lies, and the truth was the exact opposite. We were the victims of a stalker, Charlotte Corsier. So for the next 6 months, I appealed. There's a secret, everything's done in secret. There's a mechanism of appeal at Oxford where you can appeal against termination. And I published a statement on a philosophy blog, Professor Brian Leiter's philosophy blog, describing my being terminated. Well, the statement that I published was actually mostly written by an American friend of mine, and he used the phrase termination, which I thought was a bit strong, but anyway, a lot of people found that a bit funny, and some of the activists on their social media stuff, terminated with an exclamation mark. They were so pleased that I'd been terminated. So then I appealed, and I unterminated myself. I had no legal representation, so this went through the secret kind of Title IX thing in the UK. And I'm fairly effective at presenting a case and making the evidential points clear. So I was vindicated and reinstated back to my job. And I don't think I've ever heard in any of these Title IX cases of somebody being fired from their job and then reinstated. It's never happened. I mean, Stephen Galloway, for example, was subjected to something similar, and he eventually had a settlement with his university after the campaign against him. And typically with these students that are driven out under Title IX processes, if they win a legal action, they just get a settlement. They don't get to go back to their universities typically. I think there's a young kid at Yale who has recently been acquitted of a false rape accusation. He's meant to go back to Yale, but they're going to make it impossible for him. Said something like that. I can't remember his name. That's at Yale. Sunday Times published a short story about this. It's behind a paywall, so it's kind of hard to see, so you can't quite figure out what happened. Okay, so that's... there's no evidence to support this completely made-up claims about me. All the documentary evidence, witness statements, proved the exact opposite. All of the evidence was ignored. So that's what happens under the... It's not Title IX, it's called Statute 12, actually, at Oxford. But because the whole thing is secret, they can just not disclose evidence, they can ignore all the evidence, there's no oversight, there are no journalists there, sniffing around, asking questions about cover-ups and welfare notifications or the violence and stuff. Inside the university, I was actually supported by my boss, Dame Lynn Brindley. She's a dame of the British Empire. She's a lovely person, and the academic director of my college. Several other colleagues who thought the administration's behavior was grotesque, by all my students who got together to protest confidentially against it. So when these things happen, they try and do a Cliff Richard on you, and they hang you up like a piece of meat, and they expect a whole bunch of hyenas to come out and say, yeah, this is a terrible, wicked person. So the feminist activists that were not directly connected to it, most of them are actually in the US, they didn't even know about it. They began their whisper network, and they're trying, so who are all these women? They don't exist. They're searching for these hidden things. And one of them, her name is Heidi Lockwood, she's prominent in philosophy, feminist activism world, emailed me, because I think she'd smelt a rat, and she contacted a friend of mine. And she asked me what the evidence was, and I sent her the evidence. I could show you I've got a screenshot of her email, actually, somewhere, saying, whoa, you've just been completely falsely accused. There's just nothing there. And you're not responsible for what happened when she committed suicide, because her boyfriend dumped her. And there's no sexual harassment at all. I mean, she's harassing you. Here's the letter that my students wrote. It's a nice, I don't know whether I have time. How much time do I have? 10, 15 minutes still? 20 minutes?
Yeah, 15 minutes.
So I'll read this quick. Dear Dame Master Lynn Brindley and Dr. Mark Fricker, so he's the academic director. We, the undersigned, are writing to express our disagreement with your allegations made against Dr. Jeffrey Ketland, that supposed unprofessional behavior between Dr. Ketland and his female students. We are female undergraduate students at Pembroke College. The thing is, anybody who knows me will just tell you that the whole story is bonkers. I mean, everybody who knows me will say, he's not interested in women. He likes computers. They were just, and he tells jokes, and he sometimes plays the Smiths in his office, and that's it. So we, female undergraduates at Pembroke College, Oxford, are being directly under Dr. Ketland's tutorship. It's all very formal. I don't know how they learn to write this stuff. These people are going to be your political masters in a few years' time. Dr. Ketland's tutorship under our course of study here at Oxford, many of us have received his academic supervision for numerous modules in philosophy, and confidently speak for Dr. Ketland's behaviour. Let's go back, sorry. In his teaching and pastoral duties, several weeks ago we were made known of the accusations against Dr. Ketland and reported in the newspapers, as well as the rumours circulating amongst a few Oxford graduate students about Dr. Ketland being dangerous. So I've never met any of these people. These people don't know me. Didn't even know their names. Several weeks ago, a few Oxford graduate students about Dr. Ketland being dangerous. We strongly disagree with these claims. We have not met a single student in Oxford who has met Dr. Ketland and holds this view. In the last 2 academic years, Dr. Ketland has been extremely professional in his teaching. It's a bit of an exaggeration. Tutorial organisation. I mean, they have to listen to the Smiths and stuff, so there's that. Before their logic lectures, there's logic tutorials and stuff, and pastoral duties. We're fully in support of Dr. Ketland's teaching and pastoral duties there, and furthermore, believe that he has contributed very positively to the undergraduate philosophy faculty here at Pembroke. We're dismayed by Dr. Ketland's determination and belief that this has come at a great loss to our studies and experience at Oxford. So, hey, that's cool. That's Amy and Sophie wrote that. I was pretty impressed with that, because these are 19, 20-year-old undergraduate female students, and they could just see it's completely crazy. And Sophie, that I mentioned, actually had come up to me at another point and said, "This is crazy." And her mom, I think, was a teacher, and she told me about a similar allegation that she'd heard about one of the colleagues of her mom. But these vigilante feminists have by then destroyed our lives. So as soon as they've got it into the public domain, that's it. Your reputation is crushed. Everything is destroyed. You lose your friends, your family. Your Facebook count goes down from 300 social justice warriors to 250 social justice warriors, which in some sense could be a good thing. But some of those are actually people that you've been friends with for years. I was reinstated, but then after that I was silenced and threatened if I spoke out about the abuse, slander, intimidation, harassment and mistreatment, and it was a really poisonous atmosphere. So later I was quietly forced out of my job again 2 years later on a ridiculous pretext, which I don't want to get into. It's ridiculous, and ostracized and blacklisted and treated as a pariah. So I've been unplatformed at a logic conference that I was invited to a couple of years ago. A couple of powerful professors, social justice warrior professors, they're male professors, by the way, insisted that I not attend this logic conference. It's ridiculous. All on the basis of blatantly fabricated lies originating from a violent, mentally disturbed stalker and distributed by unhinged feminist vigilantes. So it's quite complicated to absorb. So I made this diagram here, which is a kind of picture of the various individuals involved. I don't know if you can see it. So we have this person, Brooke Burnson, who was, of course, his housemate, and she basically slandered me to everyone she could speak to, including Jennifer Saul of the Feminist Philosophers Group. And then there's Dr. Paula Bonington, who was her supervisor, who slandered me to basically everyone that should go anywhere near, the Thames Valley Police, the coroner, the university, blogs. That eventually led to the Kangaroo Court, which is down there, which the Shields is the name of my faculty head, who decided that he had to fire me, and I got fired. The person who technically fired me was Stephen Goss. And then I appealed, and the major input to that appeal, aside from my large mouth, was the senior coroner's letter that he sent me saying, "We're really sorry about this. This was a bad decision to read out these statements or These statements are not just, they shouldn't have been read out, these statements. So I was reinstated, and then the Sunday Times did an interview. Okay, so I'll now move on to this. This is a quote from my colleague, ex-colleague, Timothy Williamson. So Timothy Williamson is to modern academic philosophy roughly what Ed Witten is to theoretical physics. You see, complete silence. It's what Usain Bolt is to 100 meters running. So Timothy Williamson is to modern academic philosophy roughly that kind of level. He's amongst the 2 or 3 most important figures in the field. He writes very technical material. He used to be my colleague. And he was asked in an interview whether he found anything disturbing about the academic philosophy profession. I find the current atmosphere of self-righteous, moralizing, and vindictive internet mobs in the discipline deeply disturbing. He's an incredibly polite, understated professor, by the way, typical Oxford professor. Whether the mob is on the left or the right, such attitudes easily produce injustice and cruelty to individuals and unwise and counterproductive policy making. Here I'm moralizing too, and they're not naming individuals or proposing policies. The effects would be much less serious if universities could be trusted to observe basic principles of fairness and due process and to fulfill their duties of care to both students and employees, but they can't. And the subtext of this, I've not spoken to Tim since he gave this interview, but I think the subtext is not that complicated. Okay. Like most other institutions, they are more concerned to protect their reputations, which typically involve trying to cover up a problem, or, if that fails, summary dismissal of the alleged culprits. But those institutional failings are not specific to philosophy. So that's his quote. There are 2 main issues that this story or saga, 2 stories, exemplify. One is feminist, what I consider to be essentially the feminist promotion. It's not just excuse-making, but feminist promotion of domestic violence. When feminism is rape culture, it is, when it doesn't complain about rape culture, feminism is rape culture. So when men are sexually abused or sexually assaulted, that's fine. It doesn't count. There's nothing wrong with that. Actually, I'm going to take part in a mini research project with Siobhan Weir, who's a UK academic who's investigating this topic, and she's going to or maybe one of her assistants is going to interview me in a month's time. And so that's that general issue of rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, harassment with male victims and female perpetrators. And the second is the point that is really just emphasizes what Janice was saying about the feminist demonization of men, vigilantism, witch hunting, Me Too. You know all about that stuff. So that's it. Thank you. Cheers.
You said your wife left you. Did that have anything to do with the situation?
So I say that we split up at the end of November, it was October 2010. So I think it was connected to it in part, yes. It was very stressful. The whole thing was very stressful. It had perhaps been on the cards anyway for other reasons, which are quite complicated to get into, but we'd kind of grown apart. So this stuff was happening, and there's a great deal of conflict between us that had happened for several years, and so we split up. I didn't particularly want to have this relationship with this woman, and in fact I got out of it really quickly, 3 weeks in fact. But the split up was significantly exasperated by that previous 2 years. I mean, Corsa had directly involved herself in our lives. She was calling me every day for a period. And, you know, the only thing I could do was either just say, leave me the hell alone. And I knew that if I said that to her, then I would have been Benfar'd out. Right? I'm not joking. If I'd said that to her, she would be dead, and then the rest of my life would be I told her. So I couldn't tell her, just leave me the hell alone. So for several months, I'm having to deal with that problem. And the problem does actually eventually go away, all the crazy, but that caused huge damage to us. Yeah?
So, sorry, can I just ask one, because we had an exchange of emails recently, Jeff. I'd like you just to say a few words about the impact on your employability and career.
All right. Well, obviously I'm fairly well qualified and I have a pretty strong background. I also have a fairly technical, mathematical background, but there's no way I can get a job anywhere in the professional world at all. I mean, anybody that I apply to for, tech world, anything like that, they can Google me in a few seconds. The first thing they read about me is like, whoa, it's horrific. So that's it. I'm doomed on that front. When it comes to the academic front, I'm blacklisted, and it's not just in the UK. This is completely international. It's Canada, it's the United States. Some of the activists are American. It's Australia, it's Britain, it's Western Europe. So my chances of getting any kind of job or something like that are close to zero.
Thank you. First of all, I applaud your students for standing up for you and supporting you in this, and that shows that it's not necessarily a gender thing. As soon as you know the person and you identify with the person, you support it. My question is, before all this happened to you, were you on board with feminism?
No.
And do you think that your point of view and the point of view of your students and the people that surrounded you has changed drastically through your experience?
That's my point of view.
Yes.
No, I've always been... well, there's this fashionable thing about classical liberalism. Well, I've always been pretty much that. I mean, I wrote a thing in the 1990s referring to Karl Popper. Karl Popper is a famous philosopher of science. He's my academic grandfather. He's my academic supervisor, in which I refer to that. I'm kind of sympathetic to that position. So I've never really been sympathetic to the far left or the far right. I'm roughly what Dave Rubin seems to have become, but I've always been that. I've never been on board with any of this stuff. Maybe it's hard to say. Economically, I'm a centrist. I believe in social freedom. It's pretty simple. Well, it's not simple for a lot of people, obviously. I think it's pretty simple, economic centrism and social freedom. But I think that for some of those students, it may have changed their minds, but I'm not sure. I don't know.
Jeff, we'll have to make this the last question, I'm afraid.
Just following on from Mike's question, I wonder when you mention what happens when you Google your name, so what does come up? Is it the true story, at the top of the search listing, or is it the feminist faux narrative?
Well, you could do it yourself. I mean, I don't like looking because it's a bit, people sometimes talk about triggering, and I do actually get triggered by things, but I don't get triggered by the stuff you think I get triggered by. I don't get triggered by stuff talking about rape and stuff like that, or stalking or witch hunts. That doesn't trigger me. I can't even tell you what I'm triggered by. People with PTSD are triggered by really weird things, and I can't even say them. But you'd have to Google it yourself. Probably the Daily Mail story that, if you kind of click on it, it portrays me as a terrible predator and a terrible person. Maybe the Daily Telegraph story that calls me a stalker. Cosmopolitan said nasty things about me. There's the student witch hunt letter. Sorry, I should get back to the mic. So I'm not sure what the first thing that comes up. Now the thing that the interview, the Sunday Times interview, is behind a paywall, so you can't see it without Sunday Times subscription. And when I was reinstated, it was discussed on the philosophy blogs, but these blogs are run by social justice warriors. So everything that gets said and the whole comment thread underneath is all filtered through the militant feminists who can't quite figure out what has happened. I still must be a demon, I must have done something wrong, or something like that. So that's the stuff that comes up the first couple of pages. Okay, I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.